The House chamber was unusually full for a Thursday afternoon in late March. Budget reconciliation votes typically drew sparse attendance, members casting their ballots and returning immediately to constituent calls or fundraising meetings, but this session had drawn nearly 200 representatives to the floor. Not for the vote itself, which everyone knew would pass along party lines, but for what was expected to happen after. Speaker Mike Johnson had scheduled 15 minutes for procedural remarks following the vote, and word had spread through the Capitol's text message networks that he intended to use those remarks to address what he called the circus atmosphere some junior members had brought to committee hearings. Everyone knew who he meant. Everyone knew this was going to be a confrontation. Johnson stood at the speaker's rostrum with the posture of a man who had spent his entire career in rooms where his authority was unquestioned. Former litigation attorney, constitutional law professor, 6 terms in Congress before elevation to speaker, he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who believed that decorum and institutional respect were the guardrails keeping democratic government from collapsing into mob rule. His suit was pressed to razor edges. His tie was knotted precisely. His reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, the kind of detail that communicated seriousness, preparation, tradition. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of a closing argument delivered to a jury he had already won over. "The American people sent us here to do serious work," he began, his eyes scanning the chamber with the practiced authority of a teacher addressing unruly students. "They sent us here to debate policy, to draft legislation, to exercise oversight with dignity and respect for the institutions we serve. They did not send us here to perform for TikTok. They did not send us here to manufacture viral moments. They did not send us here to reduce the people's business to sound bites and social media clips designed to inflame rather than inform." He paused, letting the words settle. Several members nodded. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing what was coming next. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat 3 rows back on the Democratic side, her hands folded on the desk before her, her expression utterly neutral. She had been in Congress for 18 months. She knew what it felt like when a room decided you didn't belong there. She had spent her entire professional life in rooms like this. Johnson continued, his tone sharpening with the confidence of someone delivering a point he believed was irrefutable. "I want to address something specifically. We have seen in recent months a disturbing trend of grandstanding in committee hearings. Members, and I will not name names, though I suspect everyone in this chamber knows who I'm referring to, members with relatively little legislative experience using their 5 minutes of question time not to elicit information from witnesses, but to create moments that will be clipped and shared and monetized on social media platforms. This is not oversight. This is performance art. And it degrades the institution we all serve." The chamber had gone very quiet now. Crockett had not moved. Her face remained impassive, but her eyes tracked Johnson with the absolute focus of someone who had cross-examined hostile witnesses for nearly a decade. She knew exactly what he was doing. She had seen this tactic 100 times in courtrooms, opposing counsel trying to poison the jury against her before she ever spoke, trying to make her look like the aggressor when she was simply doing her job. Johnson leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the edges of the rostrum. "I served in the Louisiana State Legislature before coming to Congress. I practiced constitutional law for 17 years. I have argued cases before federal appellate courts. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that effective oversight does not happen in viral video clips. It happens in the painstaking work of reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses in private, building comprehensive cases over months of investigation. It does not happen when a member with 2 years of experience in elected office decides that her job is to perform for the cameras rather than serve the American people with the seriousness and humility that this institution demands." He had named no names. But the description was specific enough that cameras swung toward Crockett's seat. She had still not moved. Her hands remained folded. Her expression remained unchanged. But something in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself completely still, suggested she was waiting. Not reacting, not defensive. Waiting the way an attorney waits for opposing counsel to finish their opening statement before they stand to present the evidence that will dismantle every claim that's just been made. Johnson straightened, preparing to move to his next point when Crockett stood. The motion was unhurried, almost gentle. She did not ask to be recognized. That was the speaker's prerogative. But her standing there, calm and silent, forced Johnson to acknowledge her. He hesitated, clearly not expecting interruption during what he had intended as a monologue, then nodded with the careful courtesy of someone granting a favor they did not have to grant. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the chamber despite its quietness, I appreciate your concerns about institutional dignity. I share them, but I'd like to address your characterization of members with limited legislative experience since I believe you were referring to me. May I have permission to respond? Johnson's jaw tightened fractionally. He had not expected this. He had expected silence or angry objections from Democratic leadership or perhaps a statement released later through press offices. He had not expected her to stand calmly in the well of the House and ask permission to speak to his face, but refusing would look worse than granting, and he knew it. The gentlewoman may proceed, he said, his tone suggesting this was a courtesy he would regret. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Crockett said. She descended the aisle steps with measured precision, moving to the well of the House, the small open space before the Speaker's rostrum where members spoke during formal debates. She carried nothing. No folders, no notes, no prepared remarks. Just herself, standing beneath the flags in the galleries, in the geographic and symbolic center of American legislative power. You mentioned that effective oversight requires experience, careful preparation, and a serious approach to examining witnesses. You suggested that members with 2 years in Congress, members like me, lack the institutional knowledge and professional background to conduct that work effectively. I'd like to address that directly. She did not reference notes because she did not need to. Before I came to Congress, I spent 9 years as a public defender in Dallas County, Texas. During those 9 years, I represented defendants in felony cases where the state of Texas sought prison sentences ranging from 2 years to life. In that role, I cross-examined police officers, forensic experts, confidential informants, and government witnesses whose testimony could send my clients to prison for decades. I filed over 200 motions to suppress evidence obtained through unconstitutional searches. I won 89% of those motions because I did the painstaking work of reviewing arrest reports, body camera footage, search warrant affidavits, and chain of custody documents until I could identify the exact moment where law enforcement violated my client's constitutional rights. The chamber was silent now, every member watching. Johnson's hands had tightened on the rostrum. His face remained composed, but something in his posture had shifted. The subtle adjustment of someone who has just realized they may have miscalculated. Crockett continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the vast room. You mentioned that you practiced constitutional law for 17 years. I respect that experience. But I want you to understand what my experience looked like. In one case, I represented a man accused of possession with intent to distribute. The police claimed they had probable cause for the search because they smelled marijuana from the street. I obtained the body camera footage from all 4 officers present. In that footage, taken from 60 feet away in 95-degree heat with traffic passing, you could hear my client's music, you could hear the officers discussing whether they needed a warrant, and you could hear one officer say, and I'm quoting from the transcript I had certified, "We can say we smelled it. Who's going to check?" That case was dismissed. But it took me 40 hours of reviewing footage, cross-referencing timestamps, and preparing that motion to suppress. That's the kind of painstaking work you said happens behind closed doors, not in viral moments. She took one step forward, her eyes never leaving Johnson's. You also said that effective oversight requires building comprehensive cases over months of investigation. I agree completely. In February, I questioned a Department of Defense contractor about cost overruns on a naval vessel construction project. That contractor had billed the Pentagon $237 million above the contracted price. In the hearing, I had 5 minutes to question him. You may have seen the clip. It went viral because when I asked him to explain the overcharges, he couldn't answer. He sat there in silence for 18 seconds before finally saying the increases were due to unforeseen material costs. That moment went viral. But what you didn't see, what doesn't make it into viral clips, was the 4 months I spent before that hearing reviewing procurement documents, contract modification requests, and internal emails that his company was required to turn over through congressional subpoena. She opened her hand as if holding something invisible there. In those documents, I found emails from the contractor's CEO to his CFO discussing how to maximize billable hours during the delay period and how to reallocate overhead to the Navy contract since they won't audit until completion. And those emails were dated 8 months before he testified to Congress that the overruns were due to unforeseen circumstances. I didn't ambush him with a surprise question in that hearing. I asked him a question I already knew the answer to because I had his own words in his own hand proving he was lying. The moment went viral not because I was performing for cameras, but because I did exactly what you said oversight requires. Months of painstaking document review, building a comprehensive case, and then asking questions that held a powerful person accountable for their own documented actions. Johnson's face had changed color. Not dramatically, but enough that the cameras registered it, enough that members in the front rows could see the flush rising from his collar. He had not interrupted. The chamber's rules technically gave him the authority to cut her off, but exercising that authority now would only confirm what she was systematically proving, that his criticism had been based on assumption rather than knowledge, on what he thought her work looked like rather than what it actually was. You mentioned that you served in the Louisiana state legislature and that you've argued cases before federal appellate courts, Crockett said, her tone still measured, still respectful, but carrying an edge now like a scalpel cutting through to bone. I respect both of those credentials, but appellate work is about legal arguments on paper. It's about briefs and oral arguments before judges who have already read everything filed. It's not about cross-examining hostile witnesses who are trying to avoid accountability. It's not about reading body language when someone is lying to your face. It's not about asking questions in real time when you have 5 minutes to extract truth from someone who has been coached by attorneys on how to avoid giving you answers. She took another step forward, close enough now that Johnson had to look down to maintain eye contact, the physical geometry of the room suddenly working against him. I have spent thousands of hours in rooms where I was the least powerful person present, where the judge assumed I was the court reporter, where the prosecutor called me dear and sweetheart before learning my name, where police officers smirked when I walked to the podium because they assumed I was too young, too inexperienced, too whatever to challenge their testimony. And in every single one of those rooms, I won by doing exactly what you claim doesn't happen in viral moments. By having the receipts, by doing the homework, by preparing so thoroughly that when the moment came to ask the question, there was no good answer available except the truth. She reached into her jacket pocket, the first time she had moved to retrieve anything, and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. She unfolded it with deliberate care and held it up so Johnson could see it, though she did not need to read from it. This is a transcript from the House Oversight Committee hearing on March 8th. You may remember this hearing. It was about Secret Service protection costs at private properties owned by former President Trump. The witness was a deputy director from the Secret Service. In my 5-minute question period, I asked him about charges billed to the Secret Service for hotel rooms at Trump properties during presidential travel. He testified that all charges were standard government rates negotiated in advance according to GSA guidelines. That testimony is on the record. She folded the paper and held it between 2 fingers like a playing card. I then showed him receipts obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request that I had filed 9 months earlier and had been fighting in federal court to obtain. Those receipts showed that the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. charged the Secret Service $575 per night for rooms during presidential visits, while the GSA maximum authorized rate for D.C. hotels at that time was $217 per night. The hotel overcharged the federal government by $358 per room per night. Over 18 months of presidential travel, that produced $1.4 million in excess charges paid by taxpayers to a hotel owned by the president. The chamber was utterly still now. Members on both sides sat frozen, some leaning forward, some visibly uncomfortable. Crockett's voice had not risen, but its quiet precision was more devastating than shouting could ever have been. When I presented those receipts, the deputy director said he would have to verify the documents and get back to the committee. I asked him a simple yes or no question. Do you dispute that these receipts are authentic? 15 seconds of silence. 20, 23. He finally said he could not verify them in the hearing. That moment went viral. 6 million views in 48 hours. People shared it because they watched a federal official unable to answer whether his own agency's receipts were real. But that moment didn't happen because I was performing for cameras. It happened because I spent 9 months fighting for those documents, reviewed hundreds of pages of billing records, cross-referenced them with GSA rate schedules, and then asked a question the witness couldn't answer without admitting his previous testimony was false. She lowered the paper but did not put it away. You said members with limited legislative experience are using hearings to create viral moments rather than conducting serious oversight. But Mr. Speaker, I would ask you, how many hours have you spent reviewing FOIA documents? How many subpoenaed emails have you read personally, not delegated to staff, but read yourself line by line, looking for the one sentence that proves someone is lying? How many witnesses have you cross-examined when you had 5 minutes on the clock and they had an entire legal team coaching them on how to run out your time? Johnson's hands gripped the rostrum edges, his knuckles white. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. The silence stretched across the chamber like a physical presence. 5 seconds. 10, 15. In the gallery above, tourists and reporters leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary and unrehearsed was unfolding. 20 seconds. 25. A member in the back row coughed, the sound startlingly loud in the absolute quiet. 30 seconds. When Johnson finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier certainty. The gentlewoman has made her point. I'm not finished, Mr. Speaker. Crockett's interruption was gentle but absolute. You questioned my experience and my approach to oversight in front of this entire chamber and everyone watching at home. I'm going to finish answering that question. She paused, letting him decide whether to cut her off. He did not. Something in his face suggested he knew that stopping her now would be worse than letting her continue. You said I have 2 years of legislative experience, and you're correct. But before those 2 years in Congress, I spent 5 years in the Texas House of Representatives. In that time, I passed 23 bills into law. I served on the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, the Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee, and the Elections Committee. I reviewed thousands of pages of proposed legislation. I questioned agency heads during budget hearings. I built coalitions with Republican colleagues on criminal justice reform bills that reduced mandatory minimums for nonviolent offenses. And I did all of that while still working as a public defender because the Texas legislature pays $1,600 a month, which meant I was trying felony cases during session breaks and reviewing legislation at night after court adjourned. She took a breath, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. So when you stand at that rostrum and suggest that I lack the experience or the seriousness to conduct effective oversight, I want you to understand what you're actually saying. You're saying that 9 years of defending constitutional rights in criminal court doesn't count. You're saying that 5 years in state legislature doesn't count. You're saying that months of document review, FOIA litigation, subpoena enforcement, and witness preparation doesn't count. What you're really saying is that the work I do doesn't look like the work you're used to seeing, so you've decided it must not be serious work. Johnson's face had gone from flushed to pale. His hands released the rostrum and hung at his sides. Members throughout the chamber sat motionless, watching something that felt less like a legislative debate and more like a fundamental reckoning with assumptions that had been operating unexamined. Let me tell you what actually happens in those hearings you called performance art, Crockett said. A CEO sits down expecting softball questions from a first-term congresswoman. He's been through media training. He's been coached by lawyers on how to deflect, how to run out the clock, how to give non-answers that sound like answers. He thinks he knows how this goes. And then I open a folder he didn't know I had. I show him his own emails. I quote his own sworn testimony from a different proceeding. I ask him a question that has no good answer because I already know he lied about the thing he's about to be asked about. And the moment when he goes silent, when he realizes that I actually did the homework and he didn't prepare for someone who would do the homework, that moment goes viral not because I planned it that way, but because people are starving to see someone in power held accountable with evidence they cannot deny. She folded the paper in her hand and returned it to her pocket. You want to know why those moments go viral, Mr. Speaker? It's because we live in a country where powerful people have learned that they can lie without consequence. They can overbill the government, violate their own ethics policies, ignore subpoenas, and destroy evidence, and nothing happens to them because the people who are supposed to provide oversight either don't do the homework or decide it's not worth the political cost. When people see someone actually doing the work, so actually reading the documents, actually asking the hard questions, actually refusing to accept non-answers from people who are used to getting away with non-answers, they share it. Not because it's entertaining, because it's the way oversight is supposed to work, and they're shocked to see it actually happening. Johnson cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier authority. The gentlewoman has made many valid points about her qualifications and her approach to oversight. I did not intend to suggest, yes, you did. Crockett's interruption was soft but definitive. You intended exactly what you said. You saw viral clips of me questioning witnesses and you assumed that was the entirety of my work. You didn't ask what happened before the hearing. You didn't ask how many hours went into preparation. You didn't ask whether the questions I was asking were backed by documents, whether the witnesses I was questioning had been caught in lies, whether the oversight I was conducting was producing referrals for prosecution or policy changes or recovered taxpayer money. You just saw a young black woman asking pointed questions that made powerful people uncomfortable, and you assumed it was performance art. She took one step back, the gesture of someone who had said what needed to be said and was preparing to cede the floor. But before she moved away, she looked up at Johnson one final time, and something in her expression shifted, not to anger, not to triumph, but to something sadder and older, the weariness of someone who had spent her entire career proving herself to people who should never have doubted her in the first place. At the beginning of your remarks, you said the American people sent us here to do serious work with dignity and respect for the institutions we serve. I agree with that completely. But part of that serious work is holding powerful people accountable when they abuse the public trust. Part of that serious work is asking questions that don't have easy answers. And part of that serious work is doing the homework that no one else wants to do so that when the moment comes to ask the hard question, you have the receipts to back it up. If that work sometimes produces viral moments, it's because people recognize truth when they see it, not because it's performance art, but because it's the opposite, because it's someone doing the job exactly the way it's supposed to be done, and they're shocked to see it actually happening. She returned to her seat.